So my name is Tom Simpson. I'm a faculty member here at the Blavatnik School. I'm a philosopher by discipline working in political philosophy. And it's been a real pleasure for me to host a series of public events on the theme of international perspectives on conservatism. And the thought is that the political right, the theory of the political right, is often underexplored and is worthy of exploration. It's really interesting. And it's not just interesting, it's also politically significant. And here in the UK, we have a domestic right, obviously, which is in dialogue with European right and American right and an international right. And thinking about, in comparative perspective, what the different strands of these traditions are is really valuable and important. So it's just a real pleasure to be able to welcome Jennifer Burns to join us today. Professor Jennifer Burns, she's an associate professor of history at Stanford University. And although overall in the series we're trying not to be hegemonically influenced by American politics, it is really important to give American politics its proper due and weight. We're privileged to get in Jennifer's diary, I think in about August or September or something like that last year. And who knew that the American right would be such a dominant part of so many of our political lives right now. She's a historian of 20th century US history, working at the intersection of intellectual, political and cultural history. Her first book was on a novelist whose work I don't know nearly well enough, but Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right. And Ayn Rand's writings have been deeply influential on very many practicing politicians and culturally within America, and particularly in the American right. And her most recent book is on Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. And so the invitation and the feast I think we're about to have is to think about the various ideological influences that play a shaping force in the politics of the American right. So we've got about 20 or 30 minutes with Jennifer, and then we'll have a Q&A. I'll have a little bit of conversation. We'll have some conversation up front, and then open it up for discussions from there. So without further ado, in your hands.
Hello, thank you everyone for coming out today. I'm really pleased to be here. My topic today, in addition to talking about my research on Milton Friedman, more broadly, is transformations in American conservatism. And I realize this is a huge topic. As Tom said, when I agreed to this talk in November, December, I had a certain set of ideas about it. I think it was the end of last summer, actually, that we scheduled this. And so now I'm looking at a moving target in front of my eyes. So I thought that the most helpful thing I could do is trace some of the basic historical dynamics of American conservatism, tell you how historians have understood it, and along the way, help you understand some ways that I think American conservatism is distinctive if we're looking in this global perspective. And so I want to set up the history that maybe is the ground for us to talk about what's happening today, because it's so hard to get a grasp on it otherwise. And in considering what makes American conservatism distinctive, I want to argue 4 things. First, I want to argue it's the libertarian strain of American conservatism that makes it distinctive. And I'll talk about this in reference to my 2 books. First on Ayn Rand, Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right, and my more recently published book on Milton Friedman. So I want to use Rand and Friedman to sort of highlight the distinctive nature of American conservatism. Second, I want to talk about how this libertarian strain is being challenged by ideas that more closely resemble conservatism in other parts of the world. That is more nationalist-inflected, culturally based conservatism. Third, I want to argue that while the libertarian strain in American conservatism had its excesses, it anchored a sense of individual rights at the core of conservatism. Now, these rights were not always honored, but their articulation kept other elements of conservatism in balance, such as religious traditionalism. And fourth, we're seeing some sort of a truce right now in which the libertarian-inflected faction and the more traditionalist conservative faction share a common enemy known as the, quote, woke left or the progressive left. And I think the major question we're looking at today is, will this truce hold, or will it in fact yield some new synthesis or hybrid? And if so, if that is what we're seeing, it would be in keeping with the surprising and contradictory history of American conservatism. Okay, so I want to start, there were many places I could have started this narrative, and I decided I would start with what we call the post-war era in US history. So the post-war era, 1945 on, transforms a set of ideas that historians call the old right. So emblematic of the old right would be a figure like Charles Lindbergh and his organization, America First. And I can say more about this transition from the old right to a post-war form of conservatism in the Q&A, but for now I just want to move us towards the post-war era, because it is this moment in time that gives birth to the word conservatism in American politics. And this is the moment that conservative and liberal really become keywords in American politics and become this sort of binary that structures people's perceptions and their political alliances and their political action from then on. Now, but here's the twist, is that conservative and liberal also refer to political traditions that have been influential for centuries around the world in different forms. Yet in the United States, they're also political brands. They're political brands that get tied to particular candidates, parties, and programs. And these political brands don't line up with what other parts of the world know as conservatism or liberalism. What Americans have called conservatism, others would call liberalism or maybe neoliberalism. So I want to clarify some of that as I get going, because it's actually really important and I think goes to the core of this sort of American exceptionalism in this domain. So what does it mean to be conservative, broadly speaking? Typically, historians and political theorists have looked to figures like the Irish Protestant writer Edmund Burke, author of Reflections on the Revolution in France, among many others. And so if we think about Burke as a sort of paradigmatic conservative, a Burkean conservative, I want to highlight that it's not just the violence and destruction of the French Revolution that bothered him. It was also this sense that the revolutionaries believed they could begin the world anew, that nothing that came before was worth preserving. And so Burke offered a countervision that conservatism should look to the inherited wisdom of the past. It should be focused on generational time. Burke was not against change, but he wanted change to be done carefully and deliberately. Now, that's the philosophical or theoretical. Practically, Burke emerges as a defender of the Church of England, of the monarchy, of the aristocracy, of these older formations, and those are the formations that conservatism takes up and celebrates. So I've anchored us in British history with Burke, but we can see that this idea of conservatism could take root in many national contexts. But what about conservatism in America? What about a country that has no established religion, no established church, that fancies itself not to have an aristocracy, has no formalized aristocracy? What about conservatism in a country that is built upon the new, upon the idea of beginning the world anew? Looking at this situation in the 1950s and the dawn of the post-war era, many influential commentators, historians among them, therefore concluded there was no conservatism in America. America was liberal through and through, and by liberal they meant a focus on individual rights, representative government, limited government. But there was a problem. In the 1930s, Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had claimed the word liberal for the New Deal. And he was actually looking to Britain's Liberal Party, or the New Liberals of Britain, their efforts to expand the social state. And he attached this word to the New Deal. He said liberal now meant an expanded role and responsibility of the government in national life. And he set up the basics of a welfare state in the United States, Social Security for elders, unemployment insurance, a more regulated workplace. This is in the 1930s in the New Deal. With World War II, the United States federal government grows significantly. Mass taxation is established to meet the costs of the war. And then in the post-war era, the formations built to respond to the Great Depression and World War II really get solidified and become part of a greatly expanded federal state. So the idea of liberalism is now tied to this larger state. It's tied to the Democratic Party. So where does this leave opponents of the New Deal? It leaves them with the word conservative, and they decide to claim it. But there's a problem here. The political opponents of the New Deal often oppose the New Deal because they feel that it is unduly restraining capitalism. They would like more capitalism. And their main complaint about the New Deal and the liberal state that develops is excessive economic regulation, too high taxation, too big of a state, too active of a state. Instead, they want capitalism. But what does capitalism do? According to many observers, capitalism challenges established society. All that is solid melts into air, claims Karl Marx. Joseph Schumpeter, the essence of capitalism is creative destruction. In our own day, Silicon Valley, move fast and break things. So capitalism is about, many of its critics and celebrators argue, the relentless pursuit of the new. And all of this would seem incompatible with conservatism. So nonetheless, the 1950s in the United States saw the emergence of people who claimed to be both pro-capitalist and conservative. And among the most important of these was William F. Buckley, Jr. Now, Buckley's public debut was a book called God and Man at Yale, which attacked Yale University and the university system in general for two main reasons: teaching atheism and teaching Keynesianism. It was hard to tell which Buckley thought was worse. But he argued that the vast majority of Yale trustees would support neither of these propositions, and therefore Yale trustees should withhold their donations to the university until it mended its ways. Now, this caused a huge ruckus. It also reminds us, incidentally, that attacks on US higher education are nothing new. In 1955, Buckley went on to start National Review. And historians generally think of National Review as sort of embodying what came to be called fusionist conservatism. So conservatism in the United States in the 50s and 60s was called fusionism because it pulled together different elements. Buckley was a traditional Catholic. He was pro-capitalist, interested in the sort of libertarian ideas, not of Ayn Rand, but definitely of Milton Friedman. And American conservatism growing in the Cold War era was also fiercely anti-communist. So the synthesis of these three things gets called conservatism in America. And here I can't resist having a little Venn diagram / chart, right? So somewhere in the middle is the pure fusion. And what's important about this is that different factions can emphasize different parts of this. But in general, there is sort of a brokered peace amongst these strains. And this is what gets called conservatism in America. Now, in some sense, we could say, well, this has a relation to the Burkean idea of conservatism in that folks in this coalition want to go back to a pre-New Deal era in many ways. But it's also something different than Burke had in mind because it's incorporating into its desire to go back this strong defense of capitalism, including capitalism's sort of destructive, creative, destructive energies. And it's because, specifically, it incorporates figures like Milton Friedman. So moving on to what makes this distinctive and what makes this different than what you see in other national formations, I want to argue it's that piece about capitalism and limited government, which I'm sort of glossing with the word libertarian. And to make it more concrete, I'm going to talk briefly about Rand and Friedman and their ideas. Now, in any other national context, Friedman would be a liberal, full stop. But in the United States, it's hard to identify himself as a liberal because he's so closely identified with the Republican Party and with the pushback against what has now been called liberalism. So he places individual freedom as his central value, the freedom of the individual, the choice that individuals can make. And he argues this is why capitalism is the best system, because it underwrites this individual choice. He calls for not abolishing the government. It's not laissez-faire, but quite a minimal government, and where the price system can either allocate goods or help people make decisions about social distribution, the price system, rather than the government, should do that. And he ends up a favorite of William F. Buckley, the very Catholic conservative Buckley. Now, Buckley liked him personally. Buckley also liked that Milton Friedman was a secular Jewish intellectual, because Buckley was trying very hard to banish the stain of anti-Semitism from his political movement. And I showed you the Lindbergh slide of the old right, America First. Anti-Semitism was a more palpable part of that isolationist worldview, and Buckley really wants to signal things have changed. So it's really handy to have Friedman along, and also Friedman brings a lot of status and stature to the movement because of his accomplishments in economics and his ability to really become a cultural figure, a cultural icon. Now, we have to remember in 1969, there's only a handful of national news magazines in the United States. To make it to the cover of Time magazine is a certain pinnacle of cultural importance and relevance that I think we actually really don't have anymore, because we have such a fragmented media landscape. It's a much more consolidated landscape. So Friedman is as close to a household name as you get in a nation of 200 million people. So another influential figure in the conservative movement that emerges in the post-war era is Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand is known for her novels of radical individualism, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. She calls for even more of a minimal state than Friedman, although she's not an anarchist. But she goes too far for Buckley because she is a committed atheist, and whereas Friedman doesn't make a big deal about his secularism, Ayn Rand believes that religion is a problem and that rational atheism is a better worldview for people to adopt. So Buckley tries to push her out of the conservative movement. She goes too far. She's not meshing well with these other circles. But what I find in my research, and I describe in my book, is that while Buckley's trying to push her out and say, here are the lines and you're outside of the lines, the young people who are flocking to his movement absolutely love Ayn Rand. And many of them are actually coming to conservatism after they read Ayn Rand's novels. So she has this tremendous cultural currency. This is a tagline from her novels, Who is John Galt? That's kind of like a secret signal that young libertarians will use amongst themselves. I actually found out the person who put up this billboard is Ted Turner. So Ted Turner's father owns an advertising business, and at some point lets him fill his empty billboards, and Ted Turner loves Ayn Rand. So this is decades before CNN. But that's very emblematic, right, of the budding capitalist finding Ayn Rand's ideas and becoming so committed to them, they want to sort of spread them in an almost evangelical way. So together, Friedman and Rand represent this unique strain within American conservatism, this sort of liberatory energy, this celebration of capitalism, not just for its efficiency, but because they see it as an ethical system that's really linked to this value of freedom, of the individual breaking free, right? And we can think of all the different American mythos, the frontier, the exploration, the breaking away from the British Empire, all these different mythologies that have individuals kind of breaking free of collectives. Rand really mythologizes that and celebrates that. So too does Friedman. And Friedman argues, as a good, maybe capital L liberal would say, that you don't need a core set of values beyond this individual freedom. And capitalism puts individual freedom at its core, and people then make the choices about the life that they want to have. Now, Rand is a bit more dogmatic in that she has this idea of rationality that she really stresses. Yet her novels show the celebration of the individual, free from the constraint of society. Even if those constraints might benefit society, that doesn't matter. The individual is a unit of analysis. The individual is the ethical actor you focus upon. So you can see why outsiders thought this was liberalism broadly writ. It has a strong flavor of some of liberalism's central elements: individual rights, limited government, free markets, free trade, but it stands opposed to this new enlarged state of New Deal liberalism. It also joins together with religious believers and traditionalists, and not to mention Cold Warriors who are calling for more military spending and a more active intervention. So critics were right to say that fusionism contained contradictions, but they were wrong to assume that meant the ideas were unstable or unproductive or wouldn't last very long. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the coalition to have internal tensions. Now, I've been sort of describing the 1950s and 1960s ideas and ideologies that brought this movement together, but it quickly became applied. It quickly found purchase in political events on the ground. So conservatism in America ended up building on backlash against the civil rights movement. Here was something to conserve the pre-civil rights world. It also capitalized on social unrest, protest against the Vietnam War, the sense that society was changing. Suddenly there was something that really did seem in need of conserving. And again, universities played a critical role in this. Here is a protest from Students for a Democratic Society, organized many of the anti-war protests on campus. And here's a counter-protester for Young Americans for Freedom, the conservative youth group that Buckley helped start, that incidentally had a much greater membership than SDS, but tends to sort of fall out of the history books when we talk about campus protest in the 1960s. So the traditional part of conservatism became more influential throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Then the emergence of what was called the Christian right, opposition to racial integration as the civil rights movement progressed to things like affirmative action and busing. Also in the emergence of more liberal mores around sexuality, a gay rights movement, all of this energized social conservatives who began to warn of the new danger of, quote, secular humanism, this sort of integrated secularism that was problematic. Yet at the same time, libertarianism or neoliberalism also grew in strength. And in part, this was because of the inflation of the 1970s, the economic weakness of social democratic regimes. And I describe all of this in my book. So you see both of these strains really growing in strength as they encounter events in the world. And then just to take it up to the 1980s, it's Ronald Reagan who really makes a successful bid both for white working class voters and evangelicals, previously identified really with the Democratic Party because of their social location in the South, really brings them into the coalition. And he does so in part by using libertarian arguments about how he will revitalize the economy, revitalize the country through stripping away government regulation and unleashing a more prosperous form of American capitalism. So he even used a slogan very similar, that his policies would make America great again. So it's this synthesis that really creates the conservative establishment that really lasts until 2016. So next I want to fast forward a bit here and have to go quickly, but I'm happy to loop back in conversation. I would say that the major transformation to this worldview came with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the sort of disappearance of this external foe in communism that had really helped the different elements of the faction draw together. Because libertarians hated the state, hated communism. Religious conservatives, too, thought godless communism was a menace, and so both could agree on a sort of activist foreign policy to combat this menace. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's a general shifting. What is going to take center stage? And various movements, kind of neoconservatism, paleoconservatism, sort of rise and fall in this interregnum period. But I think we now have our answer that what is going to take center stage is MAGA. But what is MAGA? And how does it relate to what came before? MAGA incorporates, and by MAGA I mean Make America Great Again. MAGA incorporates traditionalism in many stripes, particularly on issues of gender expression, women's reproductive rights. But it has some new dimensions. One is a sort of inverted Marxism, a Marxism of the right, a new form of class analysis that's a variant of populism. It focuses on a corrupt elite. In this interpretation, educated bureaucrats and other members of the professional class have taken over the American system, and they've rigged it against others lacking education, others not in their class. So in some ways, this populist impulse, the people versus the interests, is very old, goes back into American history. But the willingness to focus so openly on class divisions is new, and it's especially new on the political right. And it comes twinned with another new element, which is a much darker portrait of America. And you can just think of the contrast between Trump's American carnage and Ronald Reagan's Morning in America. They're very different tonally, emotionally, affectively. Now, another new element of MAGA is this post-liberal movement. And this is the argument that liberalism, broadly considered, has failed. And this is an instance where American intellectuals are, for the first time, really engaging liberalism as we might in other national contexts. They're engaging liberalism in terms of the broader philosophical and ethical system that's come to be seen as part of the sort of Western political tradition. And they're saying that liberalism, transcending the Democratic Party, transcending the Republican Party as a project of sort of individual human freedom, has gone too far. That ultimately people don't want this sort of freedom. That freedom has eroded community and security, other values that people may need. And the post-liberals talk about a new willingness to use the government in pursuit of virtue. It takes the form of things like the pronatalist movement, encouraging people to have more children. Common good constitutionalism, legal theories that de-emphasize liberty, question the division of church and state, and argue that the state can and should support positive values. And the Vice President, J.D. Vance, is a good example of this, as a funny graphic of various thinkers who may be in his head. Now, this post-liberalism, these shifts extend also to the economic system, to an argument that free trade has been corrosive to jobs and communities. So just as individual freedom has undermined things that people need, economic freedom has also undermined values that people need. And so for the first time, there's a focus on the destruction in creative destruction, and a desire to rein in the capitalism and the very positive views of capitalism that have been constituent parts of American conservatism. And so with these nationalist overtones, with this focus on community, with this suspicion of individual freedom, with this suspicion of global trade, this strain is starting to look like conservatism in other parts of the world. It's starting to show a family resemblance. But clearly, MAGA has not completely thrown out libertarian ideals and a critique of the state. And we've seen this very clearly in the emergence of Elon Musk and Doge as maybe the animating impulse of the early Trump administration. Now, Elon Musk is not explicitly ideological, and that his ideas seem to have come from his life experiences more so than reading figures like Rand or Hayek. Yet Musk has also marinated in Silicon Valley culture and what's been often called the California ideology, being a blend of sort of social liberalism, openness to social experimentation twinned with a more libertarian set of economics. So I think the real question before us is, will this last? Will this synthesis of post-liberalism and sort of techno-optimism, will it last? And I would say, stepping back to history, we can notice a few things. First is that the contradictions of conservatism held for a long time. The tension and the arguments were in some ways productive. They enable lots of people with lots of different concerns to come together and to feel like they had something in common. I would say a major difference, though, is that in the history of 20th century conservatism, the enemy was external. There was always an external threat. There was always another nation, another set of foreign ideals, communism, that took center stage. Now, you're thinking of McCarthyism. Well, that's a difference. Yet, most of the focus was outward facing. And it also had the benefit of justifying a variety of different government spending programs that could be used, mobilized to satisfy different constituencies. So I think what's happening now is we are seeing the consequences of what happens when conservatism identifies an enemy within. And will that pose a challenge to the movement's internal coherence and unity? I don't have the answers. I do hope that looking to history can help us see beyond the rush of the headlines, beyond the panic, beyond the emotional impact of sudden change, and try to hold on to some of the larger structures moving beneath. And so I look forward to talking about that more with all of you. Thank you for your attention.
Great, can you all hear me? This one. Jennifer, fantastic. This is it's so stimulating. And I've got, there's so much I want to talk about. So,
dive in.
I mean, just as a kind of starting observation, just to echo your point about the changing nature of conservatism, Buckley's book that you quoted, God and Man at Yale, if I remember rightly, the subtitle is The Delusions of Academic Freedom.
The superstitions of academic freedom, yes.
Okay, so you have in the 1950s, academic freedom is coded left as a liberal value, which Buckley is going after. Mm-hmm. And then by mid-2010, something like that, academic freedom is coded right as a political cause. And it just illustrates, I think, some of the fragility of some of these policy issues and what their deep ideological roots are. So maybe more substantively, the fusionist consensus that you picked out has a common enemy in communism, mm-hmm. and that unites Christians in the United States opposed to its secular, atheistic, explicitly atheistic elements, foreign policy hawks, and capitalists. So if anything is playing that role now, it's progressive politics,
yes.
Which is having this galvanizing effect and has created the progressive politics obviously comes in a spectrum, and there are the response to the radical elements of it has created this coalition on the right, which is reacting to that. With MAGA in the ascendancy politically for a period, suddenly the opportunity for those fissures come out. Yeah. And I wonder if one of the fissures, so one of the predictions will be the coalition will stay as strong as the radical, the leading edge of progressive politics retains its ascendancy on the left. Mm-hmm. So long as that's true on the left, the prediction would be the MAGA coalition will hold together precisely because it has an enemy with which it's posted. So that'd be the first question. The second question, the stability of the MAGA coalition, there's another element that seems to me to be at play in it, which is the dispositions of those who are involved, mm-hmm. which are revolutionary rather than traditionally conservative. So I think your picture of J.D. Vance, I don't know if we just want to flip back to it.
See who's coming out of his head.
So if I recognise them correctly, on the top is Rod Dreher, who's an influential blogger with the American Conservative. On the right is Patrick Deneen, political theorist at Notre Dame, whose book, Why Liberalism Failed, is probably the closest to a manifesto we have. Peter Thiel, underneath, who funded J.D. Vance, who has a libertarian, Christian-adjacent posture, and then Sohrab Ahmari on the left. Now, I think the post-liberals have fallen out, as my understanding, and that reflects a kind of revolutionary posture that a lot of them have. And so actually that dispositional element is going to be one of the key obstacles to the MAGA movement remaining coherent.
Yeah, okay, so let me see if I can tackle those two. So one is a question about the common enemy, and I would say it might be less important that there is a common enemy than that there is the perception of a common enemy. And so I think that progressivism, wokeism has been linked as both a program of sort of social change, particularly around issues of gender and race, and then it's also been linked to Biden-era programs and interventions in the economy, and these two have been really linked. And if you listen to the experience of people like Musk and Andreessen, so Peter Thiel was sort of ahead of the curve in moving for philosophical and religious reasons to the right. A lot of these other tech leaders flipped from Democrat to Republican because of what they say were their experiences in the Biden administration with either regulation or hostility or Musk not being invited, not being acknowledged as a leader in the American car industry, things like that. So I do think the progressive movement has been linked as both a social and economic movement that people are opposed to. Now, the question is, even if there's a more centrist development among Democratic Party or among liberals, I think you're still going to see the argument, this has gone so deep in our society, it's going to take years to root it out. So I think it's going to function as an enemy for a long time, even if it's very weakened, is one part. The second, about the relationship between the post-liberals and the tech bros, maybe we'll call them that. I don't think that revolutionary energy is actually a problem. I think both share it, and I think there's a real core of Trump voters who also feel that, a desire to kind of tear down, and I think it's not just the Trump base. I think there's a broader sort of sense of dissatisfaction. And if you think about the figures I've talked about today, Friedman now seems to us, well, some people still consider him a very extreme figure, but he was considered a complete crazy person with the ideas that he came out with. If you look at the ideas in Capitalism and Freedom, it was things like, let's have vouchers for public schools. Let's not regulate currency exchange. Let's just let them go to a market. Let's not have a draft. Let's pay people to be, like things that are constituent elements of our world today were considered completely wild. So I think, I don't see that as a particular disadvantage. Now the real question I have is Elon Musk a sort of stalking horse for the post-liberal right? In other words, is he the sort of bulldozer who's going to really carve the American state up, and then its pieces will be reassembled by the post-liberals? That is a scenario I think could happen.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, because there's a suite of policy issues which I think expose this fissure between the post-liberal, socially conservative element, which often has theological roots, and the libertarian tech pro element in that sense. So immigration, I think, is one of the ones that we've seen the fissures on most obviously, which would be caution about, hostility to on the post-liberal side, but maybe welcome of, both from an ideological perspective, individual rights, freedom of the individual, plus business interests that cheap immigration serves big business in that sense. But you also have something like support for a working wage, where a working wage is a wage that a single wage earner can support a family in a kind of lower middle class kind of way, and that would be something that post-liberals will care about, and the libertarians, and they'd be willing to take interventionist actions, minimum wage, support for unions, to enable, whereas the libertarian right wouldn't. And then you have matters of social morality, so something like pornography, access to pornography would be something protected by libertarians, hostility from the post-liberal side. So do you think, and what's your thought, that we'll just the coalition will find ways of living with the tension there because the benefits of unity outweigh that? Or will one side see the possibility of victory and contest them?
You know, I think on immigration, there's probably a compromise right there, which is to be more open to high-skilled immigration and then to be more focused against trying to reverse the tide of mass migration that's happened. I think the question of technology and the regulation of technology is really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of work being done by not just post-liberals, but Christian conservatives on ways that technology should be regulated. And for a while, that seemed to fit with a kind of anti-monopolistic framework. Right now, that's a very minor note. But I think it could come back over time. And I have a feeling that what's happening right now is going to end up being very, very unpopular. And the question is if things can stabilize before the next midterm election or the next presidential election. So I think if there's an electoral rebuke of what's happening right now, the other part of the coalition will find itself in a position to kind of push forward.
Okay, very interesting. Right, let me open this up to questions. So I've got loads of questions. So can I invite you to keep your questions really quite tight, and then we'll work through them. Can I go just in the blue shirt, please? Yes, there.
Hi,
Yeah,
just very quickly, I'm curious about the one other issue around free trade and clearly Musk and Tesla's announcement that they're concerned about the tariffs and reciprocal action from other countries. I wonder what you think about that fissure and how it might develop, and what Friedman's take would be on that specifically today.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, Friedman was an unabashed free trader, and he was always pushing politicians to go in that direction. He was very concerned about capital controls. He was concerned about free movement of goods, people, right? If we think about, there's some scholars who define neoliberalism as the free movement of people, goods, you know, and that's kind of at the core of it. And Friedman really approached that from the experience of World War II. And from the feeling that protectionism led to conflict, and the way to kind of have a more peaceful world was to economically integrate it. I don't see any world in which he could be okay with tariffs and okay with protectionism. I do think he would probably be enthusiastic about DOGE and could make his peace with a lot of elements of it. I don't think the international trade piece would, because he always wanted a more borderless world. He thought that would be both a freer world and a more peaceful world.
Great. If you just hold your hands up as well, so I get a sense of who will go first. So just at the front here, please. And we'll go to the gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Hi. You situated these divisions over the years in the realm of ideas, ideologies. But what about, is the economy stupid? I mean, there's been a huge emphasis in America on prosperity, and one of the things that you might say, MAGA, the measure of whether it's going to succeed, one of the measures is, certainly Trump emphasizes very often, is people getting much better off. And if you look at some of the big shifts, whether it's the New Deal in the 30s, or what happened after 2008, the collapse of the banks, those were economic, empirical events that seem to have some impact here. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so the question is, can I put economics into the story of these shifts? The ideas that I'm talking about in terms of both Rand and Friedman were kind of formulated in one set of economic circumstances, pretty prosperous, 1950s, 1960s. Especially in the case of Friedman, they really take hold in the 1970s when there's kind of an economic slump. And these now appear as an alternate set of policies. We have to switch up the policies somehow. This is an alternate set of policies. So let's move forward with these. About the 2008 crisis, I mean, I think that part of the reluctance to punish the financial sector for what happened is that ideas about the positive impact of capitalism have become very dominant in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. So you don't have a place for a strong populist critique of the banks, say, which is a very American thing for people to hate banks. That's just not well represented in the political system. And so I think some of that is finding representation right now in the frustration of the MAGA voter. But I think a lot of that, if you look at the two main issues, it was immigration and inflation. Those were what people voted on. Right now, I would say the promises on immigration are being more met than the promises on inflation. And you know, Trump has this incredible political gravity. He's been managed to overcome many things that a typical politician would be career-ending. I don't know if he would be able to overcome a bout of sustained inflation that was clearly linked to his policies. I think that seems like the kryptonite of politicians, but we'll see.
Please.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Burns. In your depiction of the fusionist conservative doctrine, there were three elements. One element wasn't an identitarian strain, so I'm curious as to how relevant you think that is when it comes to perceiving conservatism. I know you spoke of Lindbergh's America First movement, and you reference the pushback to civil rights as being something that spoke to a proclivity to preserve traditionalism rather than something that's identitarian in nature. So I wanted to see whether identitarianism, you think, has a place in that depiction. And then you also talked about how William F. Buckley was concerned with preserving the conservative orbit from rogue actors, like, in his view, someone like Rand. I'm curious as to how much you think Buckley would see someone like Donald Trump as being someone who conflicts with principled conservatism, especially in light of January 6th and maybe characterological elements that don't align with the traditional view of what conservatism is?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So the identitarian piece, so that's sort of the word that people are using now to talk about the rise of talking about white identity or the preservation of a sort of American ethnic identity that's placed in tension with efforts for DEI, racial integration, things like this. I think that's there. I'm not positive that I would want to call it out completely. I think a lot of it is subsumed in the post-liberal discussion, and I could definitely slice out more. If you read, say, J.D. Vance's memoir, he's really identifying as Scots-Irish. He's really identifying as sort of part of a specific ethnic group. And then that's been counterposed to other, especially to immigrants. Now, J.D. Vance has married an Indian woman and has biracial children. So there's a lot of contradictions there in that. But I do think that's part of it. The other piece that I could have talked about here is what's sometimes called like the vitalist, right? You know, this is a more secular, more kind of concerned about questions of masculinity, femininity. It's very online. I think it's very important for the sort of cadres that are heading to the Trump administration. I'm not sure it has electoral purchase so much as these bigger issues do. Now, your second question, refresh me, just was about
the regulation of the conservatism.
Oh yeah, the kind of keeping lines around conservatism. Well, National Review, in fact, tried to push back against Trump. There was a whole Never Trump movement. I was just thinking about that today. Like, you know, what happened? Never Trumpers, many became Democrats. I think Liz Cheney is a really good example of a traditional conservative who took a very principled stand against January 6th, against Trump, and, you know, sacrificed her political career for that. So there's not a lot of politicians willing to do that. And I think that was just, she was sort of made an example of. I think, you know, Buckley might have taken the same approach as William Kristol, you know, who also really drew a line in the sand and has kept with that, but has come at a cost of sort of influence and relevancy. But there are definitely people who stayed there. A lot of it reminds me of the shifts that happened in the Goldwater era when the party moved more sharply against civil rights. Now, the Republican Party in the 1950s and 1960s, it was the party of civil rights. It proposed most of the major legislation. And then moderate Republicans were pushed out of the party. As the party turned against the civil rights movement, made a play for Southern Democratic voters, those moderate Republicans either became Democrats, changed their views, or just were pushed out. So I think that something similar has happened.
And just for those of us who aren't American like myself,
yes,
and others who may not know the history, just tell us about how that pivot happened, because that's quite a striking pivot in American politics.
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of the legacy of the Civil War, the Republican Party is not competitive in the South. So the Democratic Party is being elected by a white electorate, and it is vigorously anti-civil rights. And so it's the Republicans who are proposing civil rights legislation in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, both because they think that segregation is wrong and because they're attuned to this globalizing world in the Cold War in which how can you talk about American freedom and spread American democracy when you have this civil rights problem? So, but it is then President Kennedy and President Johnson who move civil rights to the forefront of their program, but they absolutely need Republican votes to pass that. And the senators who write the Southern Manifesto, they're all Southern Democrats. And so there's a shift in which the Democratic Party commits itself to civil rights with the help of Republicans, but then another group of Republicans figures out there's a backlash here, that they can be the voice of the backlash. And at the same time, there is a movement of conservatives into the Republican Party apparatus. And there's a distinction between people who are party people, who believe in the Republican Party as a political vehicle, and conservatives who are more ideological and decide that the Republican Party can serve their more ideological and theoretical interests. And it's basically like street fighting. Like they take over the young Republican clubs, they take over the Republican Party apparatus. They do so after Goldwater loses the election. So this is one of these mysteries of American politics that You have a very conservative Republican candidate, Goldwater. He loses terribly, and all his followers take over the party apparatus and control it within the next 4 years. So there's a really interesting book. Jeffrey Kabaservic has a book, it's something like The Death of the Liberal Republican, and he explains just sort of how this happens on a very granular level, and it's just very committed, very organized group of sort of insurgents and rebels who push out the more establishment types. So that's an older story. Yeah.
Yes, please. Sorry, do you mind just waiting for the microphone?
Yeah.
Just those online can hear.
Thank you. I was going to ask a version of the Liz Cheney question. So your Venn diagram,
Yes.
that could describe Hayek, right? So you don't have religion, but you have his interest in traditions and their evolutionary baggage. Then you have the free market, and then you have the anti-communism, which is related to the anti-planning stuff. So I was interested in the present, because there's some books which are trying to get the right to kind of reclaim Hayek, like Andrew Koppelman's Burning the House Down, William Easterly's anti-foreign aid book. So there's kind of people looking to Hayek as a way of reconfiguring the right.
Yeah.
And I was interested if you think there's any mileage, is it possible to form that sort of moderate right coalition around a figure like Hayek, or has he just been blown away by the new MAGA configuration?
Yeah, so question about how does Hayek relate to this, and yeah, Hayek is a really important figure for a lot of these people who come together. I think that Hayek is still important. Hayek is still out there. I think it's the late Hayek, the denationalization of money, who has like the most enthusiastic adherence right now, has kind of been taken up by cryptocurrency enthusiasts. I think right now the movement's being driven by a charismatic leader, you know, who probably doesn't know who Hayek is. You know, and so Hayek is no match for Trump right now. Maybe over the long run, we'll probably be reading Hayek for generations, and maybe we'll be reading some of Trump's speeches, but probably not really, you know, marinating in his thoughts. So, but right now there's no contest. Yeah.
Okay, good. So, yes, please, at the back, and then I've got a couple of questions online, which I'll ask.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm really curious as to what you think the counter-narrative will be on the left, given the sort of failure of the socially progressive agenda, and whether or not it will be effective, or how to make it effective. Not that I want it to be effective, but that's another.
So the counter-narrative to this rise of conservatism, I mean, so I think, well, let me take that a little bit larger. One narrative out there right now is that we are seeing globally the rise of authoritarianism, illiberal states, and that these are being run by kleptocrats and crooks who are out for personal gain, money, power. I see why that's very attractive, and it may be true, but the folks who are rising into these positions of power are not doing so solely by aggrandizing themselves, and they're not doing it in a way that's neutral on values. They're advancing a very specific and different set of values. They're advancing values about national pride, national integrity, family formation, traditional gender roles, religion. So I think to the extent that the liberal counter-narrative is this is a bunch of crooks and bad people, that's not true. It's an alternative value system that is finding lots of adherents around the world, and I think if that's not the values you share, it's nonetheless very important to recognize it is a clash of values in many ways, and then the case has to be made for the values that you feel are better, not just a dismissal of these are dangerous people. So I think that's really what has to happen both on the micro level in terms of the Democratic Party and on the macro level in terms of defending liberal democracy against the trend towards illiberal governments.
So just a question reflecting on one of the ones submitted online. So the question is specifically phrased in terms of the UK. Will the UK maybe follow Trump in a protectionist direction in terms of its economic policy? But maybe I can broaden that question and ask you to think about what's the impact that you see of these ideological and intellectual currents, the ferment that's been taking place on the right in America. What's its international impact that you've been tracing out, either historically through the 20th century or in more contemporary?
I mean, I almost think of Brexit as the forerunner of Trump, right? The kind of, you know, the canary in the coal mine or the bell in the night or whatever it was. So I think there's another way you can step back from Trump. Again, I think it's helpful to take the global perspective and to say, maybe he's not anything special, right? We're seeing anti-incumbent fervor, populist uprisings, discontent over immigration just throughout the industrialized West. So in that way, he looks less exceptional. I think that, a lot of these thinkers coming out of Mr. Vance's head are, many are influenced by European thinkers and are sort of looking, on the one hand, Europe is seen as past its prime. On the other hand, Europe is an example of more ethnically homogenous, culturally rooted, clearly identifiable national traditions that some of these conservatives are clearly really drawn to. That European nations have a coherence that they feel the sort of uber-liberal America has somehow lost. So I think there's still a lot of interchanges going on. In terms of historically, again, if you look at the UK and the US in the 1970s, they go through this almost parallel experience of inflation, the discrediting of liberal parties, the arrival of folks like Reagan and Thatcher talking about monetary discipline, reducing the size of government. And I feel like I was just seeing something like on a television program in my hotel. To me, it sounded very similar. I was like, is this the UK or is this in the US? Talking about reducing government waste and all of this. So I think these are, I think there is commonality. I would say probably the biggest one is the response to immigration, right? And I think that countries designed their immigration policies and systems in a different era without the pressures of global movement that we're seeing right now, and they're clearly going to have to be rethought because of the democratic reactions they're creating.
Yeah, right. And I suppose one of the other points of divergence would be that deep in the US's constitution and conception of itself is the separation of church and state, whereas many European nations are explicitly ones where there's an established religion.
I think that's why these nationalist conservatives are drawn to that, because they believe that there actually is an established religion in the United States. It's Christianity, but it hasn't been properly acknowledged. It hasn't been properly supported. And now the state should support it, and it's legitimate to do that. And so you have, like Adrian Vermeule is trying to set the US Constitution in a much longer historical trajectory so that it's possible to argue this Constitution can support more closeness to religion than has been understood.
Yeah, great. Okay. Any last questions in here? Okay. So maybe just the very last one is just around Friedman's involvement in the Mont Pelerin Society, which explicitly sought to define a type of liberalism as a means to defend the free society. How should this influence our understanding of him as conservative, a term which is obviously vehemently rejected by colleagues of his there, like Hayek and von Mises?
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is, to go to some of the things I was saying at the beginning of the talk. So when I'm framing Friedman as a conservative, I'm doing so really within the American context and given his closeness to this kind of hybrid movement. There's another argument about Friedman as an economist, who's someone who goes back to older ideas like the quantity theory of money, other methodologies. So there's kind of a technical reason I do that and the political reason I do that. But yes, if we step back to this global perspective, we would probably categorize him more as a liberal. And so the point of American conservatism is that it contains this counter streak within it. The Mont Pelerin Society was very important to him. He came at the invitation of Hayek. He really was absolutely a believer that, classical liberalism, as it had been expressed in the West, was not going to succeed unless it was changed in some fundamental ways, unless it dealt with the reality of mass enfranchisement, mass democratic politics. And in the Mont Pelerin Society, he proposes an idea that was near and dear to his heart, which is a guaranteed minimum income, which we think of as a very left-leaning idea. He thought of this as the ultimate liberal policy because he said this is a way to provide the support to those who cannot compete in the marketplace without, in his view, fundamentally distorting the marketplace, because you provide them with, a cash income. And, this was like hotly debated. There were people at the Mont Pelerin Society who thought this was like a terrible socialist idea, and why would you even care? And so he was not on the right faction of the Mont Pelerin Society. And so I think how that helps us understand Friedman is he's not just an economist. From the very start, he thought of his work as happening within this, what we might call a global crisis of liberalism in the 1930s. And he saw himself as both doing good economics and trying to bring this value of freedom to the world and to make a larger defense of capitalism as the system that enabled there to be individual freedom. And he was inspired both by this crisis of liberalism and he was very affected by World War II. He was very affected by the knowledge of he and his wife, both of their ancestral villages were like stops on the train to Auschwitz. So he was really thinking about the problems of the violence, state-sponsored violence, the problem of state-sponsored violence, and then the counterpoint to that being a reduced state that allows for individual freedom.
And the idea of a minimum wage is now back again with us, and the idea of a universal basic income.
Yeah, the universal basic income.
In the tech circles.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and so I think that's really interesting. I trace in the book how he eventually modifies the proposal to be a negative income tax that comes through the tax system. A version of this is passed in the earned income tax credit, and then he really stops talking about it, and he shifts to talking about education. So when Friedman thinks about questions of inequality or poverty, the first half of his career, he's worried about a minimum income. That's his solution. The second half of his career, fixing the education system, which he believes he can do through vouchers to kind of inject competition into the public school system.
So this has just been a feast, and I really hope one of the things I've taken away from this is, which was actually part of the animating impulse for this project, was an awareness that there's a ferment going on, there's an ideological ferment going on right now within the political right. There has been for about the last 8 years, I would say, actually, and its future is absolutely up for contestation right now, and I think there's inherent contingency about exactly where it ends up, and I think this is worthy of wherever one finds oneself on the political spectrum, this is worthy of reflection and careful thought. If you want more, come along next Thursday. Next week, we have Professor Lucia Santa Cruz from Chile talking about liberalism and conservatism in Chile, which is not intentionally, but it turns out is thematically connected, as Milton Friedman had personal engagement in Chile and influence on the politics there. But would you join me in just saying thank you very, very much to Professor Burns for this amazing presentation.